Welcome to Taking the Tradition On tonight. We are in Series 6, Wondrous Creatures. We are here for an hour of conversation, discussion, exploration. It's not a storytelling concert as such, though we will have stories. This is a chance to meet the storyteller, find out one of the things that they love to tell stories about, and get a little bit under the skin of the storyteller and find out a little bit more about what makes them tick. As always, I'd like to thank my fantastic patrons who help make this possible. You know who you are. You're completely fabulous, and I love you dearly. So, in this series, as ever, I'm inviting eminent storytellers to discuss their wondrous creature, explore its stories, legends, and folk tales. And I'm particularly excited about tonight's subject. Not the first thing that would have sprung to my mind, I have to say. Wondrous creature. We are going to be exploring ancient wild men. They may be more wondrous than I had originally and initially thought. And that is the pet subject of my storyteller tonight. My storyteller tonight is Timothy Mark Rouse. Here he is. Welcome, Timothy. Welcome, Tim. I call you more often. I'm going to say lots of lovely things about you now, and you have to sit and listen to them.
Oh gosh, see, I shouldn't have put myself on spotlight because now I have to look.
I know. So, we've known each other for a very long time. I remember, I think I wasn't quite judging that year. I'm very pleased I didn't have to judge when you were at the Young Storyteller of the Year, and everybody assumes that you won because you're so completely marvellous. It was a year of amazing people, and it's one of those stories that everybody tells about you that you won, and actually you always tell me off because you were one of the finalists, and Rachel Rose Reed on that occasion just pipped you. But you suddenly rose to massive acclaim, still young, nearly 20 years later, with a whole raft of other awards that you've claimed. The British Award for Storytelling Excellence in 2012. You performed all over the place. As you put it, from the muddy fields of Shropshire, as we put it, the glorious festival at the Edge, to the majestic Teutonic castle in Alden Biesen, to the sophisticated theatres of Soho and The Barbican. Did you take your ancient wild men there? What do they make of with that in sophisticated land?
Yeah, gosh, what a question. We might come.
It's all right. It's mostly rhetorical. We can face that one later. I'm just going. But I would also say that you are one of the truly exploratory and visionary storytellers. I mean, over COVID, we all had to deal with a lot of technology, and you have really sort of been pushing the boundaries and exploring new vistas for storytelling. But while you're always looking forward, there's this part of you that's always looking way, way, way back to ancient wild men, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Why? What is it about ancient wild men? And is it wild men from ancient times? Or is it really ancient wild men?
What a great question. And as I find myself growing increasingly ancient and steadily perhaps less wild, and maybe just equally a man, I don't know. That's fluctuates. So this is a really interesting question, right? And I think predominantly we're going to be looking at ancient story. We're going to certainly start with ancient stories of wild men, and then we're going to look at some of the legacies of those stories, how those have maybe kind of echoed through medieval images, and then we might get into this sort of question of like, well, why is it that we are, and why is it that people are drawn to these images, and get into sort of some Robert Bly and Jungian psychoanalysis, and how thrilling the wild man is, and the role of initiation and all sorts. So we'll see what path quite we meander through these woods as we go. But yeah.
So some will be ancient, but maybe not all. Wild men of various ages and from different times. But are we starting with ancient men in ancient times?
Yeah, you know what, actually, can we start with a PowerPoint? that's the least wild thing, but maybe
Let's
that's a
see.
good
We're
stepping
going
off point.
wild. We're
Yeah,
going wild at the beginning here
yeah,
with a PowerPoint. Yes. But I think PowerPoint is really useful because I think there's going to be some quite interesting images here of just what we're talking about.
yeah. So I was when you asked me to come along and talk about wondrous creatures, and then you sort of said a list of, and here's the list of wondrous creatures that have already been taken. My mind went to a project I was involved with, and the genesis, the inspiration for that project was um, it started with the work of French photographer. Oh, let's just jump one at a time. French photographer Charles Frege, who spent some time in the early 2010s going around about 50 different villages in 19 different European countries and capturing photographs of these wondrous costumes, these characters that people would dress up as and embody at particular ritual events during the year. And he published them in a collection called The Wilder Man. I, I don't know what that is in French, and I'm not going to attempt to guess. And they're great, aren't they? They're sort of gorgeous. And interestingly, whilst in some of the cases you might get a bit of a ritual game, like in this village, the town butcher's job is to drive the wild men off during their appearance. By and large, none of them seem to tie into folk tales or folk stories, right? They're just these kind of great promenade dressing up wondrous beings. And we have parallel traditions to that in this country on our islands. So we have straw bears. I think these are the Whittlesea straw bears, but it's not just Whittlesea that has them. Over on the left, there's some mummers outfits. This is a County Femenach mummer costume on the right. And then there's others. I couldn't get some good images, but there's sort of costumes that people make out of gorse and prickles. And again, very similar in terms of they'll promenade through the towns and the streets. In fact, I think the straw bears may date back to a kind of medieval procession where an actual dancing bear would be brought through. Much better that now we have this strawy Sats bear doing the dancing
But they do
instead.
look completely fantastic. And this is where the wondrous element really does come in. And you can start to see just the strangeness and the wonder and the mystery of them. I mean, they're just amazing.
They are glorious. So the Crick Crack Club saw the Charles Frege images. Let me just go back to them. These and thought we should do this. We should get involved. We should make some costumes. And so they put on an event at the Wellcome Trust, Wild Ones. I'll put a link to that in the chat later on because there's a lot of photos on their website. Some of the photos on their website have got people with not very many clothes on. So there's a whole big event with these costumes that they made, but also there was Punch and Judy shows. There was some life drawing. There was some kind of ritual dancing and various other kind of wild adjacent practices. And you'll notice looking young and quite pretty in the corner, there's me, because one of the things that they did is they said, oh, well, let's get people in to tell wild man, wild woman, wild being stories. But interestingly, because none of the costumes came with stories, we found ourselves kind of having to go, those of us that were brought in, reaching all over to other places to find tales that seem to fit and be in theme. And predominantly at that event, I worked on the story of Romulus and Remus, which we're going to stick a pin in that and come back to it later. But it isn't my first encounter with ancient wild men stories. If I was going to talk about that, that would be working with Simon Haywood to do a joint telling of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, I've got to credit Simon Haywood especially for this bit because I can't remember. We rehearsed it for so long, so many times. I was young and very keen then, so like everything was very like yeah. I think now he even then I think he sort of he indulged me, but didn't know that we necessarily needed to meet up every week to tell the same bits of story over and over and compare notes. Anyway, so even now having done it for months all those years ago, I can't remember which bits of the story were the ones that he worked on and which bits were the ones I worked on and whose ideas were whose. So I'm going to tell a little bit of the Epic of Gilgamesh now. Um, and credit to Simon for if anything's good, that was probably his idea. Is that all right, Amy?
I think that's fantastic, and I think it's a really great way of working on a story. I think that that's proper collaboration. When it is, it's the sum part of both of you. So I wouldn't give you or him any. It's joint, isn't it?
Mhm. And I might I might need to content warning some of this because where there are wild men, there's that other things come. So
Yes, I probably should have said that at the beginning. I did put it in the notes of the Facebook event. Taking the tradition on is aimed at adults. If you have any
mm,
younger viewers, this may be the time to send them to go make you a cup of tea.
so Evita though checked in. I think yours is young enough that nothing here can damage yours. So it begins with two brothers. One is a hunter, a trapper, and the other is a shepherd. And one late morning, the trapper, the hunter, he comes back into his brother and he says, there is something out there in the woods, in the wild places. I went out to see if my traps had caught anything, and every pit, the spikes had been pulled out and the earth had been shoved back in. Every snare that I'd laid had been snapped open. I'd caught nothing. And I could feel something out there looking at me. Do not go out into the wilds. And the shepherd said, well, it's all right for you to say don't go out, but you don't catch anything. We go hungry for the day. If I don't take the flocks out to graze, we might lose all of the sheep. So he ignored his brother's advice and he took his flocks, his herds of sheep, and he sent them out. And and it was fine. This is fine, he thought. If anything, the world is quieter than I would expect. And he drove his flocks over the crest of a little hill because on the other side there was a watering hole and there the sheep would be able to drink. And as he looked down, what did he see? That there was the mountain lion. And there was the wild ass, and there dancing in the sky were hawks and eagles, and all of these animals were gathered around a figure, a man. 9 foot tall he was and hairy all over, and he danced with the beasts and the birds, and he spoke to them in their own language, and they danced and bowed down to him. And the shepherd abandoned his sheep, turned on his heels, and ran all the way from the wild places, from the forest lands, ran all the way back to then the city that was the center of the world, the city of Uruk. And the shepherd ran all the way to the great palace in the center of Uruk, and there he threw himself down at the feet of King Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is not just a king. He is two-thirds a god and only one-third a mortal being. If anyone is 9 foot tall, it is him. His body is bronze, like it's been pulled fresh from a forge. He has an incredibly impressive beard. He has been bathed that very morning in oil and perfume, and he is resplendent. Gilgamesh saw the shepherd fall down, and he said, speak. Oh, said the shepherd, and he told the whole story. And I do not know if my flocks are alive or dead. All I know, Gilgamesh, is that you must do something about this wild man. And Gilgamesh said, there is no beast man out there. Go to the Ishtar temple and have the high priestess, Shamat, go with you back to that watering hole. If anyone can bring this creature back into the city, it is her. And I should fill you in here on the Ishtar temple. When the antiquarians, the Victorians, got their hands on the stone tablets, the clay tablets on which these stories were written, they used words like temple prostitutes to describe the priestesses of Ishtar, Ishtar, who is also called Inanna, queen of love and terror. And I don't know quite whether that is an apt translation, I know that they were famed for their sexuality, that in those tablets it writes that even the most elderly, drunk, or depressed man might see the warmth of their rosy cheeks at the window of the palace temples and then go into them, and they would make love in dedication to the goddess. So the shepherd went in, explained the mission to the high priestess Shamat, and Shamat, she put on her robe and her sandals, and she walked with him. It took them 3 days to walk back to the water. When I tell the story, I say it like this, that she let down her hair, that she took off her sandals and her robe, and she lay down by the watering hole, and she waited. And as time passed, there came the lion and the deer and the mountain ass and the birds, and last of all came this great hairy man. And as he drew close, Shamat stood up, and she dipped her finger into the waters of the pool, and she let a single droplet run down her face, her cheek, her chin, every curve of her body. And the wild man saw her, and he was distracted, and he stepped through the pool, and he took her into his arms. That, Amy, and everyone here, is how I tell it. But if you go just to those clay tablets, they're a little bit less poetic, I could say. They don't have my kind of love for a little bit of a romantic frisson. They just say that she got naked, that she parted her labia, and that she touched herself, and eventually the wild man appeared, caught the aroma of her on the air, and then he saw her and he went across the water. Anyway, she touched him, she put him inside her, and for 7 days and 7 nights they made love. Shifting positions, she stole his breath with her kisses, and at the end of the 7th night, exhausted and spent and finally feeling like he didn't have any energy for any more, the wild man went to the waters of the pool and he bowed his head and he drank. And then he saw the lion and the ass and the birds, and he tried to speak to them, but he had forgotten their language. They were afraid of him now, and they turned and they ran away back to their parts of the world. And the wild man turned back to Shamat and found that he could speak to her. She had fucked language out and into him. And she takes him in the story to the nearby house of the shepherd and the trapper, and there she teaches him how to wear clothes, she shaves his body, she oils and perfumes him down, and she decides that he is a worthy match for Gilgamesh. And in the rest of the story, kind of Enkidu and Gilgamesh are this double act, right? They form a balance to one another, and ultimately it's Enkidu's death that leads Gilgamesh into his underworld journey, but that is another topic to be covered on another day. So that's the first wild man story that I really came across. And in some ways, I think that that probably is the first wild man story. And I say that because this ancient Mesopotamian world is what we might call the cradle of civilization. It's one of the first civilizations. And you've got to have civilization in order to have the wild, right? Like there's a stage in time where we're all living in a kind of a nomadic state, wandering around the plains of Africa. We probably didn't tell stories about wild men back then because we were more in touch with the wildness around us. It's only when we start having the trappings of civilization and get obsessed with clothes and washing and so forth, that and that the fact that those things demarcate us, set us apart from a wild world of animals and beasts, that we can have this question of what is this being? Is it a wild man or not? And can we bring it into the city? So, do you want me to spotlight you back in for a bit, Amy, or shall I carry on? What sort of mood are you
Well,
in?
I can spotlight myself. Yeah, I kind of don't want to sidetrack you. I am going to pick you up slightly. I would say that nomadic tribes are not necessarily uncivilized. And that in some ways that civilization might be the most symbiotic and civilized version. And they do have stories about wild men, and certainly more modern day nomadic tribes do, because being a wild man is being alone, which is what your story about is about as well. So, there's the stories about men who go Winnebago. Is that the right word? It probably isn't. But the stories who go men who become monsters and they become cannibals. So
Yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah.
cold and in the that's the breaking of civilization, when you turn on your own and you eat your own out of desperation and cold.
Yeah, and
So
it
it's
crops up amongst the Cree as well, the sort of Wendigo stories. Thank you, Amy. No, you're really
Wendigo is the
right
word that I was looking at. Yeah.
you're really right to pick me up on that. When I just then when I was talking about kind of like nomadic existence, I'm going all the way back to our kind of like shared African heritage where we follow the migratory herds, not kind of the sort of post-African diaspora and
But I
spread
suppose
all
that's
around,
that's
really.
the thing, though, isn't it? We're social beings, and I don't think, even in our when we start telling stories, yeah, when we come together, when we're people, when we live in groups, then we don't have any memory back before that. But I don't know. I think there probably always have been wild men stories, because
Mm,
they are the ones that are outsiders. They're more with the animals than with the rest of the people. So I think there might always have been wild
yeah.
men
And I
stories.
love what you're saying about there being isolated. Like to be outside of civilization is to be that isolated figure, that outcast figure. And we'll come back to that in a bit because when we get to sort of Iron Hands and the sort of medieval European wild man characters, like a lot of them are. Um, yeah, we'll come on to that.
I'm so glad you remembered the proper term of Wendigo. I'm embarrassed to have called it Winnebago, which is something entirely different. So Wendigo stories and many others. Um, yes. So sorry, I've slightly distracted you then. But you're
No, but
right.
that's great. So let's have there then. I'm always a little bit suspicious of types because well that's a story for another day. But so we have this sense of like okay, those can be the wild man that's the isolated um, being, the outsider that might get drawn in, as happens to Enkidu in that story. Ultimately, Enkidu is drawn into civilization. I think though it doesn't always go so well for our wild men. So later on in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu and Gilgamesh decide that they are going to do something, a deed that will mean that their name echoes through history forever, that they get sort of immortality in their deeds. I'm going to go off on one for a bit more, Amy. So
Should I
I'm going to
vanish?
unspotlight you for a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, this is just me hogging the limelight. And they decided, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, that they would go to the sacred cedar forest, the forest that had been set aside for the gods and the goddesses, and that was guarded by the wild man Humbaba. Now, in the ancient Sumerian, it's Huwawa, but it's Humbaba in most of the versions that have survived down to us. And Humbaba is a wild man. In some depictions, he might almost be part of the forest himself, like the cedars have grown into and from his body. And he's terrifying, right? He wears a mask of entrails upon his face, and there's a clay likeness of that in the British Museum. And mantles of terror about his being. He is the guardian of the sacred wood. In the fragments of old Sumerian myth, the oldest surviving versions of this story, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they sneak in amongst those tall trees and they come upon Humbaba, terrified. And Gilgamesh said, please, I've come to you because I am a king and I have a sister, a younger sister, and it is time for me to marry her to one of our powerful neighbors. And Humbaba, who is a more powerful neighbor than you? It's just that while you've got those seven mantles of terror about you, I worry that if she was to see them, she'd be scared out of her wits. She'd drop dead of fright. I just wonder, before you meet her, if you might take them off. And Humbaba, being of the wild woods, he was completely taken in by this absolute lie. And he unwrapped one, two, all seven of these auras of terror. And then, when he was defenseless, Gilgamesh and then Enkidu's bidding, they kill him, which isn't great. Uh, in the later versions of this story, when we get onto sort of the Babylonian version and the Akkadian poems, that trick isn't in the story anymore. Those, I don't know if that was because culturally it was no longer the same weight, the same appropriateness to display your heroic kings as trickster figures. Certainly by the time of the Akkadians, very much we're getting into things like a sort of state religion and standardized scriptures and so forth. So perhaps it's unsurprising that in those versions of the epic, they pray, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, to Shamash, who is Gilgamesh's father, and they beg for him to send his divine winds. And 13 winds come, and they pin these powerful winds. They pin Humbaba to the ground, and it's the winds that strip him of his aura of terror. And once again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill Humbaba, and they chop down the trees. They desecrate the forest. So that's the other potential fate of the wild man, to be deemed too wild and for civilization, as it were, to destroy and then despoil the surroundings. I will just read. I found this lovely extract of what happens to those seven auras of terror after they've done the murder, and consult with the priestesses, and the priestesses are very upset, and the gods are quite angry at them. This is what Gilgamesh does with the seven auras of terror. He gave Humbaba's first aura to the fields. He gave his second aura to the rivers. He gave his third aura to the reed beds. He gave his fourth aura to the lions. He gave his fifth aura to the palace. He gave his sixth aura to the forests. He gave his seventh aura to the goddess of death. And I love, yeah, Amy, come back. One of the things I love about these little sort of fragments when you get these poetic moments like that is, I don't know what that means. I just know it makes the hairs on the back of my neck ripple up, right? Like this sort of depiction. And does that mean that then those things have a little bit of terror about them, or that there is? I don't know, or is that a kind of gifting and honouring or spreading it out back into the world? But I love these. Yeah, thank you, Laura. I love these moments in stories, especially really ancient stories, where I just don't have any context. I'm also spotting Evita commented earlier on when we were talking about wild men. She acknowledged that the first people in the Canberra region of Australia have got hairy man stories, and they are probably very, very old. So thank you for that, Evita.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I can see the aura of terror with the lions and the goddess of death, but the fields and the reed beds, is that like a protection to try and look after the crops, or the yeah? I
Is
mean,
it, yeah, is it the power of Humbaba that goes then into the earth to ensure that the crops are fertile? Like I don't know, and it's a really weird combination because it could be, and it vaguely reminds me of when the Tuatha De Danann do drive the Fomori out of Ireland in the Irish cycle. And Brace, the king of the Fomorians, gives a sort of similar list of like, oh, this is the different blessings I can offer, and in the end, the Swastijan have they go for something bigger and greater. But his list of blessings, it seems a little bit similar. Like, oh, I can bless the fields that they grow, and I can bless and so there's some sort of parallel there. But all of those are kind of really obvious positive things, whereas that list is both like, what is going on? Anyway, I
but it's,
love those bits.
and also in that story, I mean, the thing is, death is very new in the world at that point. I mean, so death is a really big thing, and so to kill somebody to get those auras. I mean, because the goddess of death is also quite new, because death has only just arrived. Um, I'm guessing that the reason he kills him is to get those blessings. but it's very strange, and I think that's the thing is we have this really ambiguous relationship with the wild, and
Yeah.
that's a really ambiguous list. And it is, do we lust for it and long for it, or are we just terrified the hell out of it? Um, we're scared to live in it. We don't want to live without it. It's we look down on it, and yet we yearn for it.
Mm, yeah. I think you're really right. There's a sort of an allure and a power, an allure and a power to this idea of wildness. Sometimes I think perhaps more power in the um, yeah, maybe not more power, but a different kind of power in the idea of the wildness than actually, I remember once, this is sort of an aside. Amy doesn't know where this is going because we didn't do this in our pre-talk. I remember once, like in my first year at university with my then partner, um, feeling one evening like we were a bit frustrated and cooped up. So we just we got on the first train and we rode it to the end of the line with this intention that we would just crash out wherever we were. And we ended up in the somewhat dilapidated northern town of Goole. Um, and eventually we found a bush to sleep under. Now she got cold faster than I got cold. So, being a gentleman, I was sort of taking off jumpers and coats and things. And then eventually she fell asleep because she was warm, and then I started getting cold. Um, and so when the sun finally crept into the blue of the sky and I woke up, actually, we realized that we'd fallen asleep under a bush that was at the bottom of a primary school playing field. So it's pretty good that I woke up quite early and got us both out. And it was not for me, as I look back, the wild romantic dalliance in which the spirits of that other and greater world and I met one another. Or maybe it was because it was cold and it was hard, and I was somewhat grateful to get back to the other side. Anyway, so that's. I'm just going to do. Sorry, go on, Amy. You were going to speak.
Well, I don't want to distract you, but I mean, this is the thing. Is like, so my mentor was Duncan Williamson, who's a Scottish traveller, and I heard lots and lots of Scottish traveller stories, which are absolutely about dealing with the wild and being out in the middle of the winter and being cold and being hungry and being wet and being tired and having to walk and it sounded like an absolute nightmare. And people kind of yearn for, again, for it's sort of a romantic lifestyle, but the reality of it is really hard. And I mean, I did go camping with him. We actually had a great time. We did it in the summer. We had options if we needed them, and it was all that thing of I'd ask Duncan if he'd want to go for a walk, and he'd look at me and go, "Why?" I mean, he'd had to do it so many times that, if he needed cigarettes from a shop 10 miles away, he'd walk and get them. But the idea of walking for pleasure was just complete. Just couldn't get his head around it, and I discovered I would make a really terrible traveller and a really rubbish wild woman, and as his sort of wife sort of said to me, is it's like, Amy, we've always needed wise women. You're the woman at the end of the in the cottage with the fire. He like lets people in and makes them a cup of tea, and I'm going, I am absolutely down with that role. That's me. I can do that.
Yes, yes, I I feel perhaps I'm increasingly comfortable in how unwild I am. I've still only got a half a dozen chest hairs, Amy. I'm just not the archetypal hairy man woodwosy of the forest. Before we leave this particular kind of like image of the ancient wild man being sacrificed, though, I do want to double back to Romulus and Remus, just because I mentioned it at the Welcome Trust event, and the story of Romulus and Remus is. That's a really interesting one, right? We probably know. I'll just paraphrase a lot of this. That they're put into a river when they're babies. Their mother is a Vestal Virgin. She's a temple priestess who sneaks out and lies with the god Mars or the god Ares, depending on which tradition you're coming from, in order to give birth to sons who will overthrow her evil uncle. And then when the evil uncle finds out about the sons, into the river they go. And the god of the river recognizes that there's divinity in them, carries them down the waterway, and they're raised by a she-wolf and passing birds, and hence this image that we've seen. You get statues of it all over Italy, and loads of other kings get ascribed to this of like having been suckled by a she-wolf in the wilderness, and therefore growing up a bit wild. Romulus and Remus eventually get adopted by a shepherd, and oh, let's go all the way to they overthrow their uncle. They meet their mum, they meet their grandfather, the rightful king. They establish their grandfather back on his throne, and then they think, yeah, it's interesting this like kingdom business, isn't it? We could set up our own kingdom, our own sort of city and land. And so Romulus and Remus go back to the seven hills that are where Rome is founded. Obviously, it's not called Rome to begin with. And they argue over which hill it should be built on. Remus likes that hill over there. I think it's the Aventine Hill. Romulus likes that hill over there, the Palatine Hill. And so they decide they will settle this by augury. They will go up onto their hills and they will wait until they see something visionary. Augury is the flight of birds traditionally. They will read in birds the fortune of those hills. And after a bit, they meet back up, and there's Remus smiling and beaming, and he says, "Oh, my brother, I saw six vultures." Now, in ancient Rome, the vulture was considered the most noble bird, the most majestic bird, because it was the only bird that didn't harm anything when it fed, because it eats carrot, it eats things that are already dead. Even a sort of herbivorous bird will at least peck at fruit or pluck grain, right, which causes some injury to the plant. But the vulture hurts nothing, so it's the most noble bird. And Remus has seen six of them. And Romulus says, yeah. Well, I saw 12 vultures. I saw. And Remus gives him a look and says, okay. And then those vultures landed all around me. It is a blessing that says if we build our city there, it will be a great place, a great home, a great settled place for people to dwell. Where are your birds? Romulus says, "Oh, you won't be able to see my birds because they flew off. They flew off beyond the horizon, and that is a blessing, which means that if we found a city there, it will be the center of an empire that spreads farther than the eye can see." And Remus realizes that his brother cares about this far more than he does, so he just lets it go. And Romulus builds the city, but Remus is a bit of a thorn in his side. And when I tell this story, I talk about how there are nights when Remus remembers the taste of his foster mother's milk. There are nights when he just wants to be out looking up at the stars as they did when they were raised by a shepherd all those decades of their early life. And Romulus keeps trying to bring him into the city to see these great walls that are being built, but Remus just isn't into it. And it's worth noting that Remus sometimes mentions to people that actually he doesn't even believe that Romulus saw 12 vultures to begin with. So Romulus gives him one last chance, brings him into the city, asks if he will rule alongside him as a king, if he will accept his responsibilities, and Remus, rejects the whole thing. And so Romulus says, "Well, do you not think at least it's impressive, these great walls that I'm building and having built?" Remus says, "Nah, they're not that impressive at all. I could leap over those." "You couldn't." "I could." "Go on then." So Remus runs and he leaps up into the great blue sky. And as he's at the zenith of his jump, he looks down. On the other side of the walls, Romulus has dug a ditch, a trench. And just there, where he has been tricked into leaping over the walls, the ditch has been filled with spikes, like you would use to kill a wild animal. And Remus realizes what has happened, and he has one peaceful moment of descent before he's impaled. And his body, his blood and his sinew and his flesh then is ground into the mortar that becomes the foundations of the rest of the walls of Rome. So it's another really powerful, I think, image of this sacrifice of the wild twin, like the wild other, in order to establish the noble and the sophisticated and the urban, at least the urban civilization. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that one out there because I think that's got some something to it as well.
I think it's got a lot to it. There's so many things in that, and it absolutely there is the sacrifice to the wild, and I mean, and that has carried on. That there is, for bridges and towns and cities for centuries. I mean, it's more recent really that we've stopped sacrificing at the beginning of founding new ventures and new buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And why we need to have, and if it is the wild or if it's the blood, or what is the need that we have to found new things on death.
Yeah.
I appreciate there's a cycle of birth and death, but does everything new need to start in death? But and maybe that is how it was always seen. I don't know. And absolutely the idea of the twins, and again you can kind of see that in Enkidu and in Humbaba. They are twinned within that story, though they're not actually twins. There's definitely the two aspects. And again it's this thing of having to put the wild side down while also desperately sort of longing and yearning back to it. And
Yeah, and this brings us really neatly. We we run ahead. We might come back to Merlin in a bit, but it brings us really nicely to Iron John or Iron Hans, which is a Grimm folk. It was a folk tale in the Grimm's collection, so it's a German folk tale. And in the 1990s, Robert Bly, who was a Jungian psychoanalyst, got really into this story. He published his Iron John, a book for men or a story for men, I think it's called. It was incredibly successful. It was in the New York Times bestseller list for 62 consecutive weeks. It spawned the mythopoetic men's movement. Um, I'll do the Iron John story very simply. There is a wood. There is a king that lives near the wood. His hunters keep going missing in the wood. And then one day, oh, this is interesting. One day, someone runs into the palace of the king, throws themselves down on their knees, and says, I was in the wood with my dog, and there was a pool, and we got close to the pool, and a great hairy hand came out of the pool and dragged my dog in. And the king goes, ah, this is where all my hunters have been going off to. So he sends his soldiers out. They drain the pool and they find in the bottom of the pool this big, rust coloured, hairy man. And because the soldiers are there and they're more than a match for him, they drag him into the king's palace. They put him in an iron cage, and the king decrees that no one will let him out of the cage. Um, so I've told that a little bit long, just because what interesting parallels between the imagery from Gilgamesh and Enkidu being the wild man in that first story, and Iron Hands in the King. The rest of the story, the king's son's got a golden ball. One day, while he's playing in the garden, he throws his golden ball into the cage. The wild man won't give the golden ball back until the king's son, the prince, lets him out. The wild man runs away. The prince thinks, oh, I'm going to get in trouble for this. So he runs away as well. And then there's a series of challenges, other businesses in other kingdoms, in other courts, and the wild man kind of keeps cropping up as an advisor or fairy godmother figure to the prince, until eventually the prince is married and becomes a king in his own right. And lo and behold, a spell is broken. It turns out that the wild man was enchanted all along. He was another king in his own right, which was how he knew all about courtly manners and so forth. And he just needed to be freed by a young man of virtue. Robert Bly read this story and, oh, he felt that hidden in it was like a code for masculinity that showed him kind of, and he drew parallels on different initiatory traditions from around the world. And he kind of wrote then this sort of this guide to masculinity at that time in the early 90s. He already had this sense of kind of this confusion of the male identity. I think there has always and perpetually been a confusion of the male identity, but never mind. And he thought that was a great guide to it. And maybe there is something to that, but he got obsessed with Iron Hands because he found it in Grimm's. You can find slightly different versions of that folktale all over Europe. Sometimes it's Merlin, sometimes it's a bird, sometimes it's a different creature, sometimes the task's different, sometimes the wild man is caught in different ways, right? There is, if it's a code, it is a code with a lot of different variations, with a lot of different regional specificity to them. And like, it's not for me to besmirch or call into question the sort of way that I think some psychoanalytical takes on folk tales. Like, it's great that people get inspired by them. I'm reading Clarissa Pinkola Estes' Women Who Run with the Wolves at the moment, and her analysis is great. But there's something of me and the way I relate to stories where I kind of think, like, stop telling the stories what they mean, right? Like, that's nobody is so wise that they get to give a definitive interpretation. Anyway, a bit of a rant there, as much of a rant as I let myself get away with. And yet there is something recurring. Martin Shaw gets into it. Clarissa Pinkola Estes gets into it. Robert Bly got into it about this, like, who is this aspect of ourself that is the wild other that we need to meet, that we need to encounter in order to be complete in and of ourselves? Like this sense that, oh, there's something missing in us because we're not complete until our great and hairy bone collecting other self comes and finds us along the way.
And then we murder them.
And then we went, yeah, well, or they resurrect us or whatever. Like, yeah, or we murder them in some versions of the story. Yeah. And I see the appeal. I'm fascinated by it as well. God, one of these days I'm going to treat myself to a wilderness vigil when I've got a week free in my diary for it. But goodness, I'm so suspicious of anything that thinks there's an answer. Evita says some stories are just medicine.
I think most stories are just medicine. I mean, I think that's the thing, is that you need to, for me, I need to have lots of stories, and that's where I go to for anything. So when I have questions about what is it to be a woman, what is it to be a mother, what is it to be, then the stories are there waiting for me to work my way through them. But it might be a very different way to the way that other people meet those stories, and I meet the same stories in different ways at different points in my life. And stories that I totally didn't get when I was 12 suddenly kind of at 15 kind of go, or they change with you. So and that is the brilliant thing about it, is that like you said, I don't think there is a definitive meaning. There may be a definitive meaning for you when you meet them at a certain point when you need them.
But so I'm suspicious also of the idea. So sometimes, I don't know if you get this, but sometimes I feel like I'm asked or I'm expected to be able to have a story for a particular event. A story for a funeral, or someone's died, or a story for some conflict resolution work. And I sort of feel like you needed the story some time ago.
I think telling stories about death at funeral is the wrong time.
Yeah.
It's absolutely, it just becomes patronising, and there's a massive point to it. You need to have those stories ready. And
absolutely, you need to have lived
totally
them.
with you on that.
Yeah, if I would say, I go so far as to say that stories are a life belt that we throw to a future self who may or may not, and we don't know which of the stories that we meet and that we work with are going to be the ones that save our lives. But that's why we need so many of them, and then we fling them forward, and who knows, in a few decades' time, maybe we catch them. But
I love that as an image, Tim. I just think that's fantastic. I really love it.
There you go. That was worth the price of admission.
Yeah, definitely. But there is obviously something about the world and the wild man, and I might not go along with everything that Robert Bly says, but I mean, I think men have had huge expectations, and I mean, that's a whole, it's not an hour. That's kind of so much to talk about patriarchy and the way the expectations of men. And I think that we have a need for those stories because they're so pervasive, and and they are, from very, very beginnings of stories and civilization, and there's still plenty now. We're still, and the billion recreations of Tarzan. I mean, how many versions of Tarzan are there? And how we keep coming back to Merlin, which we've sort of glossed over. We glossed past. We sort of sped past Merlin, didn't we? But and the way the many stories of, we've had lots of people coming from the wild into civilization, but there's also wild men that from civilization that regress, that go mad, that go wild and back into the wild, who may then come back, but that needing to just be out in the world, away from people, and to become that wild man for a while. So this, it was something that I hadn't thought about until you brought this up, and then it's just, I've been going down all kinds of rabbit tunnels in my head that I've really appreciated. So thank you very much. I have rabbit tunnels that I want to pursue and questions that I still want to ask, many, but I promised that we would have a Q&A at the end, that if people wanted to ask questions at the end, they could. So if you want
let's de-spotlight for now. Boomph, that's me, and so that was just that I can see. Is that all right? So we can see everyone, or would you rather?
No, well, we won't be able to see everybody. We'll just be able to see their questions, Tim.
All right, okay.
So we'll have the questions on the chat. So feel free to just be ninja typers. Type as quickly as you can if you have questions, that burning questions that you want to ask and that you've been repressing through this hour, that you do want to ask Tim now.
We've got a story from the American South, Wiley and the Hairy Man. The Hairy Man is a frightening and powerful magician, but easily fooled. There's something in that as well, isn't there? Like they're very cunning, these wild men, but sometimes they're a bit trusting. I think in many ways that's quite an honest depiction of the contrast. Oh, I think I might have heard that Wiley and the Hairy Man.
And it's a bit of an indictment about civilization, isn't it? And that's where it's within civilization that we become more cunning and we learn to lie and deceive.
Yeah. I think Len Cabral. I think it's Len Cabral tells that story, perhaps, that I've heard. Yeah. Reminds me of how Inanna received or stole the attributes of the goddesshood from her father. Yeah, that's Norman. And the three different, or at least I'm aware of sort of three different versions. Like, does she win them from him? Does she seduce them out of him? Does she just get him drunk and pilfer them? And then she has his it's not mana. What is it? It's an M ma sound. What? Anyway, yes.
But they're also, I mean, some of those, they are her birthrights as well, aren't they? So they're things that he'd already stolen from her mother. So,
oh, this is good.
At least in some of the versions. So yeah, Jane's saying Jacob and Esau might be more examples, one smooth and one hairy. Nana, what is you? You're going me. I'm confused. That's obviously
May. That's what she's saying. That's what they're called, isn't it? It's the May. Yes, thank you, Nana.
Sorry.
That's what they're called. The May.
Romulus sounds like he was the firstborn of the two. Was he?
I'm sure he would claim he was.
I think you're right. So I am quite interested in while people are thinking that they might have more questions. I know we haven't got very long, but I am quite interested in the men who go back to the wild. And I know we've mentioned Merlin several times, but not talked about his wildness and whether wild and mad are the same thing within that story or not. And I'm quite interested to have your take on that.
Yeah, and I would a little bit of a plug for, if you get a chance to see Adderstone's telling of Mad Sweeney, which is I think it's 11th century, based on 11th century text. It's about an Irish king, and it's during the kind of conversion of Ireland from its pagan roots to Christianity. He's an old pagan king, and whether it's that he gets involved in a battle that's too much for him, or whether he can't cope with this new religion that's coming over the land, or whether he just gets ill, he retreats. He lives like a bird in the trees, and he eats watercress, and he's definitely no longer he becomes a wild man. He also dies in the end to a trick. Sorry, that spoiled it, didn't it? La 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 la. Ignore that, but it's still worth seeing. It's an incredible show. Um, and Lancelot goes mad, dwells in the forest, is wild. Merlin repeatedly, sometimes he's there to begin with, sometimes he just ends up there from it. So I think there are these characters that become wild men, either because that outside place makes more sense, or that's the only place that, and we're right back to what you said at the start. Like the wild man is just the person that is cast into beyond civilization. So Fred asks a great question then, is the green man the wild man? And obviously you've got Janet Dowling's phenomenal Green Man taking the tradition on. And I think the answer ends up being no. I think they're a bit different because the Green Man, even the sort of vegetative Green Man,
I mean,
oh
Humbaba does sound very like the Green Man. I mean,
yeah,
there's
so there is
certainly
something.
connections with him, but not all wild men.
No, no, not all wild men are green men, and not all green men are wild men. Um, I'm thinking of things like Al Hidra is. I wouldn't say he was a wild man. He's too much so the sort of the immortal Sufi, the Green Knight of Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, arguably, you could call him a kind of wild man, and again, he's that kind of like because he's someone who's been cursed and now has to be an outsider and come back in, and the oil of mercy Adam image from Green Men. Again, I would say that's not a wild man. So Evita says wild and connected to nature. People are still afraid of the wild people, maybe like the witches. Hmm.
Well, and to be fair, possibly with a certain amount of good reason. I mean, and that is the thing with some of the wild people. Yes, connected to nature, may be able to talk to the animals, but it's where everything has gone down to an emotional and instinctive level where you can't talk to them, where you can't reason with them. It's almost like it's sort of going back to being a toddler as well, isn't it? You take what you want,
Hmm.
and I mean that priestess went and deliberately tamed him. Um, but you know, if you're not out to tame a wild man and you take their fancy, then you might not be much you could do about it. So they are dangerous.
Hmm. There's something sort of quite interesting there, and Eden asks about whether this wildness, while mad, is more about the need for isolation, just getting away from people, or perhaps being driven away from people. I can feel other rabbit holes opening up to start digging into, but now is not the time.
I mean, there seems to have been to me sort of the sort of three major groups, I suppose, that we've talked about tonight, and I think there are many, as you say, many other rabbit holes. But there's the union with the wild, and the
Yeah,
kind of and the longing and the separation and the very much aware of the that kind of having the union, then devising, then that union kind of goes to the sacrifice of the wild and having to sacrifice the world to become something else, to become something different. And then we seem to have gone into a third phase that I think is maybe more recent of the wild as a healing space, which is the
mm,
people going mad and the need for isolation, the need to go back to the wild, where that is Merlin, where that's maybe kind of like in stories like the Crescent Moon Bear, where you have the soldier coming back from the war
yeah,
who can't bear to go into a house, who's living in the wild and has to be once again tamed by a woman, in this case tamed by his wife, and kind of healed back to a space where they might be able to develop their relationship again, in a very interesting kind of reflection of how the priestess tames Enkidu, but kind of having almost gone full circle. But I want to go full circle back to you and your fascination with the wild and the wild man, and where you're at with the wild man. So you're kind of quite interested in this wilderness ritual. Do you feel that you've missed out on that wild side of
have
you?
I missed out? Um, One of the things that Martin Shaw has written about running wilderness rites of passage and initiatory rites of passage is that sometimes he will get someone that has gone on one of these events and then get to the end of it and they think, oh, I don't know, nothing happened. They go, really, nothing happened? No, nothing happened. I didn't have the experience. There was this deer that came every morning and would sort of sit and be there as I woke up. And there was a bit where I was sort of going into a bit of a trance because I hadn't eaten for a few days and I was seeing the faces of all my ancestors in the trees and they were talking to me and I realized that I could see the different constellations of the stars at the night acting out this great drama above me, but nothing really happened while I was there. And there's something quite liberating about him talking about the people that have that experience. Because it's almost like you can, if you go to the wild desperate, doesn't necessarily mean the wild's going to like meet your desperation. Like it's just going to be there and you could still come home feeling the same emptiness. So maybe, yes, I do. I'm desperate for it. And like I'm going to be at the Hare Moon Storytelling Festival later on, which is this year, which is a lovely little storytelling festival. Only about 60 people at it, and that's in a wood. Outdoor showers, saunas. I can remember being there last year in the sort of outdoor shower, and I kind of turned up at this festival going, I don't really know what this is. I've been booked, so I've gone along, but. And as I was there with the water cascading over me, I looked up and there was a blue tit that had caught itself a great big fat green caterpillar and it was just holding the caterpillar in its mouth and singing. Like you could see how proud it was of the breakfast that it had caught, that it was singing out, and it was, if I'd stretched, I could have touched it. And there was a sense where I'm like, oh, okay, this is what it's about. This is why the people that come back to this festival every year come back to this festival every year, because where else perhaps do you get those experiences? But it's there, isn't it? Like the woods are, I could go and sleep in the woods overnight, and I don't. And as Fred says, you can't think yourself into the wild. So yeah, the wild and me. I don't know. I've got my stick. I've got my. I can rip this shirt. I deliberately wore a shirt with poppy buttons in case I felt compelled to. Um,
Feel free.
but maybe it's best for everyone involved if I don't.
We can see your 6 hairs.
My whole 6 chest hairs.
But then I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? But you have all the wild stories, and maybe that's the thing, isn't it? Is kind of we don't necessarily need to go and sleep in a bush at the bottom of a primary school field, if we can go and have all these really wild experiences in the stories. And we do live in a civilized and different world, and there's a whole other set of dangers that we have to face. And I think we do go out into wild spaces. If you talk about wild and mad and dangerous, which is certainly what the forest used to be. I mean, like, we don't have lions and bears and tigers and wolves in Britain in the forest, but we do have dangers that we have to face, and we do have dark alleys and dark spaces and places where the rules don't count or aren't obeyed. And we do need a bit of a map for that. We need to maybe confront that and face it and have a bit of a wild, but it's much safer to do it in a story.
Yeah.
And yeah, we can journey forth with people who have lived on nothing but watercress for a week and experience those things, and maybe sometimes get more learning from that than doing it ourselves, so that we're not just in a trance and weak from hunger and on the point of death, or I don't know.
Thank you. No, don't say I don't know. Thank you. That's a perfect summation. Actually, we are going to close. Just before we close it, I just want to bring attention to Eden's comment that the shirtless bit should be reserved for the Patreon. So that's a
I think we could do that.
top tier donation. Okay.
We could definitely do that. And Norman saying, for him, the wild man is the keeper of the boundary between city, story, and forest. That's it. I think that's another really wonderful image. Thank you, Norman. I love that. And I think that those are the right notes for us to bring this to a close. Yeah, if you want to support taking the tradition on and become a patron, there may be a really exciting moment of six hairs on the patron site soon. If I can talk Tim into that. If you want to find out more about Tim, he's already told you he's going to be at the Haremoon Festival this summer, which is May in Cambridgeshire, the East Anglia, that neck of the woods. Not quite sure where. Is that close enough?
Yes, Ashling Woods in Cambridgeshire. They've got they're too wild to have a website. But if you sign up to my mailing list, then I can send you the details. Or they do have a Facebook page. They're not so wild as to not have a Facebook profile. So
and this is the key thing of getting in touch with you and finding out all your events. So how do we sign up for your mailing list, Tim?
Sure. So I do have a website. It's timrouse.com, but it's a bit out of date at the moment. It's in a perpetual state of needing some updating. If you post your email in the chat, Evita, if you post it, like send me a private message with your email address, I will sign you up to my mailing list. That might be easiest at the moment. I do have little sign up forms and things that I can link you to, but honestly, I'm not sure that any of that's working at the moment. So thank you, Evita. I see that, and I will just copy that away. So good. Wonderful.
So yes, and if you sign to the mailing list, then you'll hear about Haremoon Festival. You'll also hear about Stealing Thunder, that you're going to be out in June, which is up in the Lake District, fabulous festival, and any other events. Because I mean, you know, this is our message to the future. We're flinging stories out, not to our own future selves, but to lots of other future people, because this will be up on YouTube, and you know, it doesn't matter whenever or wherever you're listening, you're very welcome. The mailing list will still be there, even if the other events have already passed. And hopefully Beasts and Tales will still be going long into the future. You can go this month, you can go in 10 years' time. Tell us more about Beasts and Tales.
Beast and Tales is a monthly storytelling club night that I run in Beeston just outside Nottingham. That's because there's another Beeston just outside Leeds. And we do a live stream as well. So if you're not local to Nottingham and can't make the trip, you can tune in, and Karen, who's here tonight, is our live stream wizard. The next event is Kirsty Stubby, who's a Swedish storyteller, telling the hairy girl. What could be more appropriate, a slightly perhaps more feminine wild energy for us, the hairy girl, which is her version of Tatterhood. It's got taiko drumming, it's got all sorts of things in it. Yeah,
Fantastic.
so that's happening, and a link to buy tickets from that has just been shared in the chat. So that's the Ticket Tailor link to Beast and Tales, and then we have other events coming up. We've got Rachel Rose Reid in May. We've got Jan Blake Touchwood in June. Catrice Horsley September. All sorts of people coming along to that one. So
Fabulous. Again, sign up to Tim Ralph's mailing list. You'll hear all about it. And taking the tradition on, we'll be back in April. I'm cooking up some wonderful guests for the next draft. So patrons, I will be in touch with you soon about what's going on in April, May and June. And for everybody else, keep an eye on my Facebook page at Amy Douglas Storyteller or on the YouTube site. But for now, I think we should all just, like, you know, turn off our computers, run out the doors and into the wild. So thank you very much to my guest Tim Ralphs, and thank you to all the wonderful people listening. You are all completely fabulous. But that is it for this evening's Taking the Tradition On.